Hello, everybody. We're going to wait. We're looking at the attendee list, and we're going to wait a couple more minutes for a couple more folks to log on. Hello, everybody. We have a good amount of the attendees logged on, so we are going to go ahead and start. Hi, I'm Ray, and I'm the project manager for water certification at SES Global Services. I'm joined today by Dylan Waldheater, and he's the program manager for AWS North America. You'll meet him in just a moment. Today, we're going to talk about the International AWS Standard version 2.0, which is a streamlined and very implementable version of the standard. Before we get started, I want to go through a couple of logistical notes. Everyone is in the listen-only mode. During the webinar, if you have questions, you can use the web dashboard to type them in, and please use the chat area to type in your questions. We'll try to answer them at the conclusion of the webinar. You can also hide the dashboard by clicking on the orange arrow at the top, and you can choose to view the presentation in full screen mode rather than the window mode. Okay, here we go. So the agenda was developed appreciating that the audience includes various levels of understanding of the standard. It's important to note that the information today that we're providing is based on version 2, the provisional final, distributed to AWS members for a vote on January 17th. AWS is currently working on a plan for public distribution of the standard in Q1 2019. Today I'm joined by Dylan, and again, Dylan's the program manager for AWS North America.
Thanks, Ray. Good morning, all. Thank you again for joining us. As Ray mentioned, I'm the AWS program manager for the Water Council. The Water Council represents the North American regional partner for the Alliance for Water Stewardship. We're located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, near the shores of Lake Michigan, where we are today, and the temperature is negative 50 degrees with the wind chill. So we're freezing, but needless to say, we're grateful to be sharing this information with you remotely. We wouldn't have wanted any of you traveling to experience Milwaukee on a day like today. Before we dig in, I just want to mention that the purpose of today's webinar is twofold. As Ray mentioned, the audience varies in their level of AWS familiarity and knowledge. So first, we're going to give some introduction to AWS and the AWS standard, and then we'll take a high-level look at some of the changes to AWS standard version 2.0. On today's webinar, we aren't going to dig too much into the details or substance of the criteria and indicators in the new standard, but we will discuss major changes and encourage you to keep these major changes in mind once the final version is made available. Additionally, we just want to make sure that we're transparently available to you all as you digest the new standard and have questions. So our contact information will be available at the conclusion of the webinar. As Ray mentioned, we'll also field some questions at the end. But again, we can't at this time get too into the details of version 2.0 as it isn't publicly released yet. So as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, this is the AWS definition of water stewardship. It begins by identifying these 3 high-level impacts that water stewardship aims to achieve. And so AWS's role in achieving these impacts is to move sites beyond simply managing water as an input to production, but rather as an asset that must be stewarded. So it accomplishes this by going beyond traditional site-level management and requiring that the site, for one, engage stakeholders, and then additionally encouraging action outside the fence line of the site. We live in this world of complex water-related challenges, everything from not enough water to too much water to infrastructure challenges, poor governance structures. And as a result, businesses are facing varying types and degrees of water risks in very hyper-localized contexts. So it introduces some questions. How does a business go about understanding their water use, the corresponding water risks, and how does a business go about addressing them? So enter the AWS standard. The AWS standard is the mechanism for answering these challenging questions. It's recognized as the global benchmark for water stewardship. There really isn't anything else like it in the market that's solely dedicated to and focused on water. The standard is a strategic framework. It outlines a series of actions, criteria, and indicators for management of water at the site level and how water could and should be stewarded beyond the boundaries of the site. The goal of the standard is to encourage continual improvement towards achieving best practice in what are now 5 key outcomes. Sustainable water balance, which has quantity-related considerations, good water quality, good water governance, healthy status of important water-related areas, and the newly added WASH, water sanitation and hygiene. So simply put, AWS is providing common language for stakeholders to engage around and address water-related challenges, risks, and to create value from water stewardship practices. The application of the standard itself is intended to be adaptive. It can be applied by any site in any sector, anywhere in the world. It's also not prescriptive. So the criteria and indicators are really providing a framework for businesses to understand their water use at a given specific site and within the context of the catchment or watershed that they operate. All of this is accomplished through what is now a 5-step process that begins by guiding a site through gathering information to understand and contextualize their site challenges, risks, and opportunities. Once the site level challenges are understood, the site consults relevant stakeholders to identify shared challenges with an eye towards opportunities for collective action. It also guides the site through a process, again, of identifying water risks and opportunities. This all lays the groundwork for the creation of a site-specific water stewardship plan. That plan is implemented, regularly evaluated to respond to the shared challenges, risks, and opportunities that are identified. Simply put, the standard presents a management systems approach to mitigating water risks and capturing water-related value. Also worth noting is that there are varying levels of performance that are intended to recognize increasing degrees of effort and impact. Those are listed at the bottom of this slide here and go from core to gold to platinum. So the AWS standard is really the heart of the Alliance for Water Stewardship, but it's importantly supported by 3 key programs. These are intended to enhance credibility, build capacity, and provide for shared ownership in the system. On the top, the AWS accreditation and claims leads to credibility amongst individuals working in the world of water stewardship, as well as for sites that are applying and implementing the AWS standard. So it accomplishes that by providing the opportunity for third-party certification, which demonstrates that a site has successfully completed the 5 steps of the standard. Certification to the standard is the ultimate goal for most sites that are implementing the AWS standard. Independent verification provides additional level of assurance to internal processes as well as external stakeholders that the site, their claims of good water stewardship are truly credible. The AWS training program increases capacity the sharing of knowledge, and really seeks to enable professionals to implement water stewardship practices at their sites. We'll talk a little bit about the first training opportunity for version 2.0 that'll be offered in partnership with SCS Global in March of 2019. We'll share details on that at the end of the presentation. And then lastly is our membership. Membership really promotes shared ownership. The members own and shape the AWS system, and we have a very diverse and expansive membership, which is critical to the organization's success and really creates a unique and important space for different sectors to collaborate on water stewardship. So who's moving the Alliance for Water Stewardship forward? This is a good graphic here, does a good job of emphasizing the unique and important collaborations that make up the Alliance for Water Stewardship. You'll notice private sector organizations like Nestle, Nestle Waters, Procter & Gamble, General Mills, along with NGO groups like WWF, the Nature Conservancy, and CEO Water Mandate. These different organizations are doing everything from advocating for the AWS system to providing complementary tools and programs to helping on improvements and having shared ownership in the new standard. And I just will emphasize again that these collaborations are really critically important for the credibility of AWS and the success of water stewardship globally. The AWS headquarters or secretariat is located in Scotland. In order to best serve the differing needs in varying parts of the world, there are regional partnerships established. This includes offices in Africa, Asia, Pacific, India, Pakistan, and as I mentioned before, the Water Council, where we're located today, represents the regional partner for the Alliance for Water Stewardship North America. AWS North America serves the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
So now we want to look at some of the high-level improvements in version 2.0. And the first improvement to talk about is the standard organization. The standard organization, we've gone from 6 steps to 5 steps, which is very helpful. We're looking at, each step consists of a number of criteria to be addressed. Each criteria has 1 or more indicators for compliance. And throughout the standard at this point, icons have been developed for AWS outcomes, and they're identified throughout the standard with criteria and indicators. One thing I might want to go back and mention is really how we got to version 2.0. And just so you understand that it has been a 2-year review process to get to version 2. There's been a lot of revisions have taken place. It's been overseen by the AWS Technical Committee, and there have been multiple stakeholder consultation calls presenting and discussing different aspects of the standard. One of the other changes that we've seen is the standard is now aligned more with ISO. We're using the verbal form within the standard itself. Words like shall are in the standard. If you're familiar with version 1, I think you'll be happy to know that the guidance no longer reflects to conform with. All of that language, any conformity language, is used in verbal form, and it is included in the standard. One of the things that is streamlined in the standard is the criteria and indicators. And I want to just provide a really quick example of one of the changes that's been made. For the physical scope of the site, that's a simple process to understand. The old standard requested the physical scope as a criteria, and then there were 4 indicators which requested additional information that was required to meet the criteria. Some of the indicators wanted the information discussed. Other indicators requested it being mapped. In the new version, there is 1 criteria which is very similar to the old, the criteria in version 1, and then there's only 1 indicator, and the indicator is very specific. This information will be mapped, and then it goes through and lists the information that's required on the to meet the criteria. And this makes it much easier, much more consistent for implementation, and also it ease of simplification for auditors at the end of the process. The other thing that has been changed is we now have developed guidance, and there's guidance for both the catchment and stakeholder engagement. They are separate documents from the standard, so they can be updated as required, and they also can reflect more regional or more pertinent issues. And the guidance will also be issued with AWS when they issue the standard.
Additionally, you'll notice that the theme of WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene, is more prevalent in version 2.0. This is reflected in its inclusion as a 5th outcome. So we've moved from 4 outcomes to 5 outcomes. WASH as a concept has really always been critical to good water stewardship. The execution of WASH was already included in version 1.0. So while it has been added as a 5th outcome, been pulled out, been given greater importance in the standard itself, its application really isn't too much different. You'll notice on this slide some of the similarities between version 1 and version 2.0. The standard is still asking for most of the same things from the site as it pertains to WASH. So what's new as it pertains to WASH? As stated before, and is now probably becoming redundant, it is the 5th outcome of the Alliance for Water Stewardship. In addition to that, sites are required to undertake all activities related to WASH as they are the other 4 outcomes. So the criteria and indicators in the standard are uniformly applied across all 5 outcomes. So for example, the way that best practices are applied and executed in the standard and applies to the other 4 outcomes from version 1, it now also applies to WASH as a 5th outcome in version 2. We won't dive too much into the details on this topic today, but if you'd like to discuss any of these changes offline, again, please reach out to us upon final release of version 2.0.
So now we're ready to start to look at the path toward stewardship. And again, this is very similar to version 1. We've just had consolidation and not elimination. We start out with step 1, which is now gather and understand. It was the previous step 2. In this step, you collect the data for the site, you look at the catchment, begin to identify and engage stakeholders, and based on that information, you begin to determine shared challenges at the site, risks, and opportunities within the catchment. Step 2 is the combined step 1 and step 3 from version 1. And it's really the commitment to water stewardship and development of the plan. It's very, very straightforward. Step 3 is now the implementation. And again, this is taking steps towards stewardship. Your implementation is typically dependent on your understanding of the standard. And as you progress through the standard, your knowledge and the understanding expands with time. The 4th step is evaluation, and that's when at the point where you're measuring your progress, you're proposing modifications to your plans, you're looking at your goals. Are you assessing, are you meeting your goals? Do you need to make changes to them? You're also beginning to look at promoting continual improvement and strive for those best practices that you've identified. The 5th step is communicate and disclose. Again, that is consistent with version 2, the last step. And here you're telling your water stewardship story, and you're building your stakeholder engagement. I want to go over step 1 a little bit. And again, these are really broad changes. The intent of step 1 is to gather the site information on water use and catchment context. Then the site uses this data to understand its shared water challenges, looks at water risks and impacts and opportunities. The information is ultimately used for the development of the site's water stewardship strategy. The reorganization is key in step 1. and it provides a logical process for implementation and it really leads to ease of implementation. The consolidation, again, we see that more in step 2, but the consolidation, again, just simplifies the use of the standard. And we do have a new understanding of best practices. This is a new requirement, and you need to, users should identify and understand the best practices as related to the 5 outcomes. It's identified in the start and carried throughout the standard. Here you can see a little bit better the reorganization of step 1. So initially you're gathering the information. You're looking at the site scope, stakeholder, who the stakeholders are, what their influence is. Again, your water-related site data, indirect water use, and ultimately your water-related catchment data. The progression is just a good example of how the data is collected. Again, as Dylan mentioned earlier, there is no prescribed order, but this just is logic. It's a more logical approach. And then the second part of step 1 is understanding. And here you are understanding your water challenges, you're looking at shared water challenges, looking at risks and opportunities at this point. And again, you're looking at your best practices towards the AWS outcomes. And this is the new criteria that's been added beginning in step 1. Step 2 is, again, this is very similar to the last version. It combines step 1 and step 3 of version 1. The primary change to step 2 is the commitment is either by the site or by the organization, or potentially by both. And but other than that, there's not much change to step 2.
So this sort of lays out the first couple of steps in the process as we've discussed so far. Again, begins by gathering information to understand your site, the catchment, the watershed that you operate in, and then your water risks and stakeholder or shared water related challenges. All this data you're collecting and processing really helps to inform 2 important questions that will then help you develop your water stewardship plan. Those 2 questions are: what are the water risks and opportunities facing your site, and what are the shared water challenges in the catchment? As we know, water risks take many different forms. They'll vary by site, vary by region. So that data collection and processing and understanding step is really critically important for contextualizing the water-related challenges and risks at your specific site, so that you can plan for and then in turn implement the most effective practices for accomplishing the 5 outcomes of good water stewardship.
And step 3, the implementation step. At this point, the site is implementing the stewardship plan. They're mitigating risks. They're driving the actual improvements in performance. Implementation is streamlined with the reorganization. Indicators are more specific and add consistency across sites and regions, again, for both implementers and the auditors. The application of best practice has also been revamped, and with requirements for both core and advanced criteria. And again, we will wait for the final standard and guidance for more information on that.
So then the last 2 steps, 4 and 5, really aren't much different from version 1, beyond the inclusion of some of that action language that Ray mentioned early on in the presentation. The intent of step 4 is to evaluate the site's performance to the water stewardship plan, define the value that's created as a result of implementing that plan, and to consult with stakeholders on opportunities for potential improvement. It's important to note that the stakeholder engagement process and evaluation is not seeking consensus, but rather continuing communication with them to identify opportunities for engagement and improvement. The plan in 4 is then modified and adapted to incorporate any of the lessons that are learned from that evaluation. Step 5, the intent is to encourage transparency, accountability through communication of performance and other relevant information to your stakeholders. So this is an important process. It's intended for relevant stakeholders as defined by the site stakeholder engagement process. As it exists, version 2 doesn't really require any publicly available disclosure, but we'll see and have further discussions about how that's all applied as we review the final version of the standard and the stakeholder specific guidance that Ray mentioned previously. So this graphic simply lays out the entirety of the process. For those that are familiar with version 1 of the standard, you'll notice that it's fundamentally the same. Version 2 is version 1, the way that the process really works and is laid out. That being said, we're quite confident from looking at the provisional final that things really are streamlined, that the standard itself is really more user-friendly, and that those that are implementing the standard will have an easier time doing so. Those that are auditing to the standard will have an easier time auditing due to some of the more direct and explicit language around what is required within the criteria and indicators. Yeah.
And one thing that is, consistently important throughout the standard is that the standard is based on how water stewardship can be driven by site level actions. And those actions lead to actual catchment level impacts. It's important to understand at the input stage what is required, so you have sufficient resources and staffing, and then just to recognize that the water stewardship plan is what drives the progress, and you're able to modify the stewardship plan throughout the implementation and lead towards greater catchment impacts. These ideas are being reevaluated within AWS, and they are finalizing their documentation on theory of change. So many people, now that we've walked through the standard, we can kind of look at how a site actually implements the standard. And basically, you have to start off with obviously reviewing the standard. Download the standard at A4WS and attend a training, an AWS sanctioned training, so you really get the full understanding of what the standard is. It's important to screen your site water stewardship principles, and this is just initially your review. You can start, some sites have already evaluated water risk at this point. It's time to pull, this is the time to pull that information together, just to really kind of decide where you're at on site. The next step would be to contact a CAB or your AWS partner to discuss a process. And this is specific, again, based on your site, what your existing conditions are, what type of resources are available, and what your internal drivers are. Once that you have a plan, then you start to implement the standard. And again, the time frame for implementation varies from site to site and within different regions. And it's really dependent on the complexity of the site, the amount of resources that you have, and what type of drivers, whether it's to have the right people on staff. Once you have gone through the process, the sites are audited by the CAB, and with the certification audit is quite straightforward. It's a snapshot of where you are. The audit begins with a desk review prior to the visit, so the auditor is familiar with the site information. Then typically the audit itself is just 2 days on site, and stakeholder interviews are conducted at that time. If the site does have conforming information, then it will receive the AWS certification. And it is important to remember that it's a 3-year certification and annual verification audits are required. Okay, so as we talked about, we are going to be hosting a AWS training in March with AWS in Emeryville, California. We have information on that. We will be sending out more information, and we'll be with to everyone that's been involved in this call.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And we're expecting pretty high demand due to this being the first North American training to version 2.0 of the standard. So please do review the details and reach out to us if you have any interest or questions related to this training in March. So with that, we're happy to take questions. If we don't get a chance to answer them today, again, we encourage you to reach out to us offline, and we're happy to discuss some of the additional details related to the AWS standard version 2.0.
So if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box. And like again, unfortunately, we can't provide a lot of information on 2.0, but we did want to get the information out there for you. Does anyone have any questions or anything that you'd want us to describe again? Oh, here we have something. Okay, wait. Okay, we're catching these questions.
First question is, can I get a copy of the slide deck?
The presentation will be sent to individuals that have participated.
The next question is, do you have to comply with national water-related laws to comply with AWS? Is there a specific indicator to comply with applicable laws? The short and quick answer to that is yes, absolutely. Water governance is one of the outcomes of good water stewardship, and there are requirements that the site both understand and identify all water-related laws and governance structures, and then in turn that they have a process in place for ensuring that they are meeting all of their regulatory requirements that relate to water.
Okay, the next, there's also a question related to, are the AWS documents available in different languages such as Spanish and Portuguese? If not, are you considering translating these? Right now, AWS is provided in English, and SCS will be working with some of our auditors in South America to provide this presentation and other training events in Spanish and Portuguese. So if you're interested, contact me at SCS Global.
Yeah, and just to elaborate that on that from AWS's perspective, for those looking for assistance in different languages, we'd encourage you to evaluate the different AWS regional partners that may be able to offer some of that assistance, as well as the conformity assessment bodies that may have professional expertise and ability to translate some of the information that AWS is requiring. Are there plans for additional North America training in 2019? Absolutely. The location and date of those are to be determined, but we will do everything we can to get that information out to everybody as soon as there on the calendar. Is there information on additional trainings beyond the California training in March if space will be limited? A similar question. Yes, we will be hosting likely 3 to 4 trainings in the year 2019. We often host one here in Milwaukee due to this being our headquarters. And in addition to that, potentially somewhere on the East Coast, with also some consideration given to Canada and Mexico. Again, as soon as those are all sorted out, we will be certain to share that information so that you can plan on attending the trainings. A question about the guidance that'll be accompanying the standard. Are there only 2 separate guidances, the stakeholders and the catchment? No, the answer to that is no. There will be regular guidance that will complement the standard, but it's being kept separate from the standard so that it's more flexible and can be updated and tailored to address different challenges that may arise. So what we were pointing out there is that there will be stakeholder and catchment specific guidance as well. That's a bit further developed from what you might have seen in version 1 and provides some more clarity around what AWS is looking for as it pertains to stakeholder consultation as well as catchment identification.
Period.
Just evaluating a few more questions here, just a moment.
There is a I can answer this one. There's a question on, does AWS now require sites to complete steps 1 through 5 prior to seeking certification? Historically, it was ambiguous. I think that's why we put in the slide on ready to implement, because yes, you do need to conduct all 5 steps prior to being audited.
Do you know when version 2.0 will be released by AWS? As Ray mentioned in the beginning, AWS is currently working through a plan to get everything into proper form and then communicate it to public audiences within the first quarter of 2019. And again, as with the training, as soon as that information is available, we will certainly communicate it to all those attending on the webinar today. There's a question here about expanded guidance for 1.8 sector best practice identification. We're certainly anticipating that with that being a new component of version 2.0, that there will be complementary guidance that will assist a site with how to apply those concepts.
Okay, there's a question on what would you summarize will be the main differences between Standard 1 and Standard 2 for auditors. Honestly, Standard 2 is much more specific with respect to the actions. So it's going to be, for an auditor, it's going to be more straightforward. It's going to be easier to audit and to be consistent. There will be less auditor interpretation required in version 2.
There's another question about the March training and detailed agenda for the training in March. If you go to awsnorthamerica.com, I think we can go back to that page.
Oh, it won't let us go back, sorry. There we go.
Yeah, that website there, you'll find a registration link that'll provide significant details relative to that training in California in March. If you have further questions, again, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer them for you.
There's another question about, are there any changes to requirements for surveillance under audit, under version 2.0, particularly for an AWS certified facility? Surveillance is only required for AWS certified facilities, and it's the opportunity to confirm that the site is continuing into practice there's water stewardship standard, and it's my understanding that there will be no changes with respect to conducting the surveillance audits. They are required annually for 2 years after initial certification.
Yeah, if you're wondering about transition from version 1 to version 2, you can expect to see some pretty concrete details on how that'll all be sorted and handled by AWS. That'll all be included with the public release of the standard. So stay tuned for information about how that process will work. There's a couple of good questions in here about best practices and the application of best practices. They're great questions. We're certainly happy to answer them. But I think it's in everybody's best interest that we await the new version of the standard, and then we'll make note of who the asker of those questions are, and we'll follow up with you to ensure that you understand and have an answer to your question. That summarizes the questions. Thank you. They're great questions. Thank you all for attending and participating. Again, the standard it's imminent. It's on its way. We're really excited about how it's applied and what it has to offer for implementers and sites that are looking to exhibit excellence in water stewardship. So if we didn't get to your question today, we will note them and do our best to follow up with you offline. And please feel free to reach out to us with any questions or even just have a discussion about the new standard. We're happy to have those with you. We hope you're as excited as we are about getting your hands on the new standard, diving into it, applying it at your sites. Thanks to SCS for hosting. Ray, if you wanted to say anything else.
And I just want to actually thank Dylan and AWS for participating with us. Again, we will be providing additional information when the standard is final, and please feel free to contact Dylan or myself with any questions. Thank you very much.